You know that moment when you realize you've become the villain in your own love story? Mine happened in a courthouse hallway, watching my husband of 7 years sign divorce papers with hands that didn't shake, not even a little. That's when I knew I'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. I'm Maria Rowe, and I destroyed the best thing in my life over a 10-second interaction that I replay in my head every single day. But the truth is, it wasn't really about those 10 seconds at all. Jack and I met during what I now call my scrappy years, when I was 26, waiting tables at an upscale bistro downtown while finishing my MBA at night. He was a regular, always ordered the same thing: grilled salmon, no sides, black coffee. Polite but distant, the kind of customer who left exactly 20% and never made small talk. Then one evening in December, I was having the shift from hell. The kitchen was backed up. I'd spilled wine on a customer, and my manager was breathing down my neck about table turnover. When I brought Jack his usual order, my hands were visibly shaking from stress and exhaustion. "Rough night?" he asked, and something in his voice made me actually look at him for the first time. Really look. He had these warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression of genuine concern that caught me off guard. "You could say that," I admitted, surprised at my own honesty. "Well, for what it's worth," he said, cutting into his salmon. "You handle chaos better than most people handle normal days." It wasn't a line or a pickup attempt. Just a simple observation delivered with quiet kindness. But after the night I'd had, it felt like a lifeline. We started talking after that. I learned he was a freelance graphic designer, working mostly with small nonprofits and local businesses. Not glamorous work, but he spoke about his clients with such genuine care, like their success personally mattered to him. When the animal shelter needed a new logo or the community center wanted flyers for their fundraiser, Jack treated each project like it was his masterpiece. "You really love what you do," I observed one evening as he showed me mock-ups for a literacy program's website. "I love helping people tell their stories," he said simply. "Everyone deserves to have their message heard, clearly." Looking back, that should have been my first clue about the kind of man he was. Someone who understood that behind every project was a human being who needed to be seen and supported. We dated for 2 years before moving in together, another year before getting married in a small ceremony at his parents' house. Nothing fancy, just family and close friends. But it felt perfect because Jack made everything feel perfect. He had this way of being completely present, whether we were grocery shopping or planning our future. When I talked, he listened with his whole attention. When I was stressed about school or work, he'd make my favorite tea and ask the right questions to help me work through whatever was bothering me. The man paid attention to details I didn't even know mattered. He remembered that I liked my coffee strong in the morning, but preferred decaf after 3 p.m. He knew I got cranky when I was hungry and would quietly put together a snack before I even realized I needed one. He celebrated my small victories like they were major achievements and supported my dreams even when they meant less time together. "You're going to do incredible things," he'd tell me when I doubted myself during those final months of graduate school. "I can't wait to watch you conquer the world." And for a while, it felt like we were conquering it together. Everything started changing when I landed my dream job at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized marketing firm with an impressive client roster. Finally, I was using my MBA, working with real budgets, making strategic decisions that actually mattered. The salary was double what I'd been making, and suddenly we could afford things we'd only dreamed about. A better apartment, nice dinners out, vacations that didn't involve sleeping on someone's couch. Jack was genuinely thrilled for me. He helped me pick out my first day outfit, bought champagne to celebrate my first successful campaign, and never once seemed threatened by my success. If anything, he seemed proud to be the husband of someone climbing the corporate ladder. "Look at you," he'd say, watching me get ready for another late meeting or client dinner. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." But somewhere in the whirlwind of deadlines and client presentations, I started viewing our relationship differently. Jack's quiet contentment with his small-scale design work, began to feel less charming and more limiting. When colleagues asked what my husband did, I found myself downplaying his freelance status, sometimes even making it sound more corporate than it was. He's in design, I'd say vaguely, hoping they'd assume he worked for some big agency rather than helping the local animal shelter with their newsletter. The shift was gradual but relentless. Jack's evening routine of making dinner and asking about my day started feeling less like partnership and more like obligation. His suggestion that we spend weekends hiking or visiting his parents felt like interruptions to my career momentum. When he'd text during the day to check in or share something funny he'd seen, I'd respond with brief, distracted replies that clearly communicated I had more important things on my mind. "You're different," my sister Carmen observed during one of our monthly lunches. "More intense. Are you happy?" "I'm successful," I replied, which wasn't really an answer. "That's not the same thing," she said, but I was already mentally composing an email to a client and barely heard her. Around my second year at Morrison & Associates, I was assigned to work closely with Blake Harrison, a senior account executive who was everything I thought I wanted to become. Sharp, driven, always impeccably dressed. The kind of person who commanded attention when they walked into a room. Blake worked 12-hour days, traveled constantly, and spoke about work with the kind of passion I'd once reserved for Jack. The secret, Blake told me over drinks after a particularly successful client presentation, is knowing what to prioritize. Most people get distracted by personal stuff and never reach their potential. I found myself nodding along, even though something about the statement made me uncomfortable. But Blake's lifestyle looked impressive from the outside. Corner office, company car, respect from colleagues who hung on every strategic insight. Blake became my unofficial mentor, and slowly their perspective started shaping mine. When Jack would suggest we plan a weekend trip, I'd find myself thinking about the projects I could be working on instead. When he'd want to talk through a problem he was having with a difficult client, I'd feel impatient, like his small-scale concerns were beneath my attention. "You're supporting someone else's dreams instead of focusing on your own," Blake observed one evening when I mentioned canceling dinner plans with Jack's parents to work on a presentation. "That's sweet, but it's not going to get you promoted." The worst part is that I started repeating these conversations to Jack, reframing Blake's career advice as relationship wisdom. "Maybe you should think bigger," I'd suggest when he showed me a logo design for a local bakery. "You have real talent. Why limit yourself to these small projects?" What I was really saying, of course, was that his work wasn't impressive enough to reflect well on me, but I dressed it up as concern for his potential, as if I was the one pushing him toward greater success, rather than someone who was embarrassed by his contentment. Jack would listen to these suggestions with a patient expression, then gently explain that he loved his work, precisely because it was personal and meaningful. "I'm not trying to build an empire," he'd say. "I just want to do good work for people I care about." "But don't you want more?" I'd press, genuinely confused by his lack of ambition. "I have more," he'd reply, looking at me with an expression I was too self-absorbed to interpret correctly. "I have everything I need." The changes in our relationship didn't happen overnight, but looking back, the signs were everywhere. Jack stopped sharing details about his projects unless I directly asked. Our conversations became shorter, more functional. He still cooked dinner most nights, but we'd eat while I scrolled through work emails or reviewed presentations for the next day. "Remember when we used to talk?" he said one evening, after I'd spent an entire meal responding to messages from Blake. "We're talking now," I replied, not looking up from my phone. "Are we?" he asked quietly, but I was too distracted to notice the sadness in his voice. Our physical connection suffered too, but I told myself that was normal for a couple who'd been together for years. The truth was, I was always mentally somewhere else, planning the next campaign, strategizing about office politics, replaying conversations with Blake about career advancement. Jack tried different approaches to reconnect with me. He'd suggest we take a cooking class together, plan surprise date nights, even offer to help with my work projects. But every gesture felt like another demand on my time. another distraction from the career momentum I was finally building. "You're always somewhere else," he said one Sunday morning, when I'd spent our planned brunch time taking a conference call with a client on the West Coast. "This is important," I snapped, annoyed that he couldn't see how crucial these connections were for my success. "So are we," he replied, but I was already walking into the bedroom to continue the call in private. His parents, Helen and Frank, had always welcomed me like family, but I started finding excuses to skip their monthly dinners. Work emergency became my standard explanation, even when the emergency was just me wanting to get ahead on next week's projects. "Maria's so dedicated," Helen would say to Jack, trying to be understanding, but I could hear the hurt in her voice when he'd arrive at family gatherings alone yet again. The saddest part is that Jack covered for me, making excuses I didn't even ask him to make. "She's working on something really important," he'd tell his family, his friends, our neighbors, protecting my reputation even as I was destroying our relationship. The morning everything fell apart and started with what should have been good news. I'd been unofficially told that I was being considered for a promotion to senior account executive, Blake's level, the position I'd been working toward for 2 years. The official announcement wouldn't come for another week, but I was practically vibrating with excitement. I woke up before my alarm, immediately reaching for my phone to see if there were any overnight emails about the promotion. Jack was still sleeping, and for once, I actually looked at him, really looked. He seemed smaller somehow, like he'd lost weight, and there were stress lines around his eyes that I didn't remember seeing before. But the moment passed quickly as I started mentally preparing for the day ahead. I had a presentation at 10, lunch with a potential new client, and dinner plans with Blake to discuss strategies for my new role. In the kitchen, Jack had already started coffee and was making scrambled eggs, my favorite breakfast, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd sat down to eat it properly. "Morning," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Thought we could eat together for once." I was already checking email, scrolling through messages while I talked. "Can't today. That presentation is make or break, and I need to review my notes one more time." "Maria," he said, and something in his tone made me glance up. "Can we talk, just for a few minutes?" "About what?" I asked, already distracted by a message from Blake about our dinner plans. "About us," he said quietly, "about where we're heading." I looked at him more carefully and realized he seemed nervous, almost fragile, but my phone was buzzing with notifications, and I could feel the day's momentum pulling me forward. "Tonight," I said absently, typing a quick response to Blake. "We'll talk tonight, okay? This promotion thing has just been consuming everything. But once it's official, things will calm down." Jack stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Sure. Tonight?" I was already moving toward the bedroom to get dressed, my mind shifting to the presentation slides I wanted to review one more time. When I emerged 15 minutes later, fully dressed and ready for battle, Jack was by the front door putting on his jacket. "Heading out," he said, his voice oddly formal. "Good luck today." "Thanks," I replied, grabbing my bag and car keys. "Don't wait up tonight. Blake and I are celebrating after the presentation." He stood there for a moment, watching me gather my things with the frantic energy that had become my normal state. Then he did something he hadn't done in months. He reached out like he was going to touch my arm. "Maria," he said softly. "Before you go, could I get a hug?" I stopped dead, staring at him. A hug? Now? When I was clearly in crisis mode about the biggest day of my career? When every minute counted and I was already running behind schedule? Something about the request felt so needy, so childish, that it triggered a response I didn't even know was coming. "Seriously," I snapped. "Right now, you're not a kid, Jack. Grow up." I pushed past him toward the door, my irritation growing as I thought about how this was exactly the kind of emotional demand that Blake had warned me about. Successful people didn't have time for this kind of neediness. I yanked open the front door and gestured impatiently for him to leave first. "I don't have time for this," I muttered, and slammed the door behind us. In the elevator, we stood in complete silence. I was already mentally rehearsing my presentation, completely unaware that the man standing next to me looked like he'd been physically struck. When the elevator opened in the lobby, we walked in opposite directions without a word. The presentation was flawless. The promotion became official that afternoon. Blake took me out for champagne and told me I was everything they'd hoped I'd become when they first started mentoring me. "This is just the beginning," Blake said, raising their glass. "Senior executives don't have time for the kind of personal drama that holds other people back. You've proven you can prioritize what matters." I felt validated in a way I'd been craving for months. This was what success looked like. Clear priorities, professional recognition, respect from people who understood ambition. It wasn't until I got home that night, flushed with champagne and victory, that I realized Jack wasn't there. His keys weren't on the hook by the door. His laptop wasn't on the kitchen counter where he usually worked in the evenings. I called his name, thinking maybe he was in the bedroom or the bathroom. But the apartment was empty in a way that felt different from his usual absences. Heavier somehow. On the kitchen counter was a note in his careful handwriting. "Staying at my parents' tonight. We need some space to think. Congratulations on your promotion." I stared at the note, feeling confused and slightly irritated. Space to think about what? And why couldn't he just be happy for me instead of making everything about our relationship? I texted him. "Got your note. Not sure what this is about, but we can talk when you're ready to be rational." He didn't respond. For 3 days, Jack stayed at his parents' house. I told myself it was probably for the best. I had so much to handle with the new promotion. Getting up to speed on bigger accounts, longer hours, more responsibility. His absence actually made things easier. But on the 4th morning, I found myself really looking around our apartment for the first time in months. Jack's presence had been fading so gradually that I hadn't noticed, but now the signs were everywhere. His favorite books were no longer on the coffee table. The throw pillow he always used while watching TV was gone. His coffee mug, the one his sister had made for him in a pottery class, was missing from the cabinet. In our shared home office, his desk was completely clear except for a single folder labeled "For Maria." Inside were copies of bills he'd been paying, subscription services he'd been managing, household tasks he'd been handling without me even realizing it. Below those were printouts of conversations with his therapist's office, appointment confirmations dating back 3 months. Jack had been seeing a therapist for 3 months, and I had no idea. At the bottom of the folder was a letter addressed to me, dated the morning of the hug incident. "Maria, I've been trying to find the right time to have this conversation for weeks, but there never seems to be a right time anymore. I've been seeing Dr. Martinez since January because I was struggling with depression and didn't know how else to cope. I kept thinking things would get better when you got the promotion you've been working toward, that maybe once you felt more secure professionally, you'd have room in your life for us again. But watching you celebrate last night, seeing how happy you were talking about your future plans that never once mentioned me, I realized you've already made your choice. I don't blame you for choosing your career. I blame myself for staying silent while you grew to resent everything about our life together. I should have spoken up months ago when you started looking at me like I was holding you back. I should have been honest about how invisible I felt, how lonely it's been loving someone who stopped seeing me as anything more than an obligation. The hug this morning wasn't about affection. It was me hoping for some sign that I still mattered to you, that we still mattered. Your response gave me my answer. I'm staying at my parents' while I figure out what comes next. Take all the time you need with the apartment and our things. I just need some space to remember who I am when I'm not constantly trying to earn your attention. I hope your promotion brings you everything you're looking for. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing another layer of pain I'd been too self-absorbed to see. The depression, the therapy, the months of trying to reconnect with me while I pushed him further and further away. The worst part was realizing that the morning of the hug, he hadn't been needy or childish. He'd been drowning, reaching out to the person who was supposed to love him, and I'd responded by telling him to grow up. I drove to his parents' house that evening, the letter clutched in my hand, like evidence of my own callousness. Helen answered the door, and her usual warm smile faltered when she saw me. "Hello, Maria," she said politely. "Jack's in the backyard with his father." The politeness hurt more than anger would have. This woman had welcomed me into her family for 7 years, and now she was treating me like a stranger because I'd become one. I found Jack and Frank working on an old wooden fence, something that clearly didn't need immediate repair, but gave them an excuse to work with their hands while they talked. They both looked up when I approached, and Frank quietly excused himself, squeezing Jack's shoulder as he walked past me without making eye contact. "I read your letter," I said without preamble. Jack set down his hammer and turned to face me fully. "Okay. Why didn't you tell me you were struggling? Why didn't you tell me about the therapy?" He gave me such a look of weary patience that I felt smaller than I had in years. "When would I have told you, Maria? Between client dinners? During the 5 minutes you spent at home before rushing off to your next work event? Or maybe while you were explaining to me why my career wasn't ambitious enough?" "That's not fair," I protested, though the words felt hollow even to me. "Isn't it?" he asked quietly. "When was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not how my work was going or whether I'd picked up groceries, but how I was actually doing." I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't remember. "The depression started last fall," he continued, his voice steady but tired. "Around the time you got assigned to work with Blake, I watched you light up talking about work in a way you never lit up talking about us anymore. I watched you become someone I didn't recognize, someone who seemed embarrassed by our quiet life together." "I was never embarrassed by you," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. "You introduced me as just a freelancer at your office holiday party," he said gently. "You canceled dinner with my parents 6 times in 3 months. You haven't asked me about a single project I've worked on since last summer." Each statement was factual, undeniable, and devastating. "You stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as dead weight," he continued. "And the worst part is, I started believing you were right. That's why you're in therapy." "That's why I was in therapy," he corrected. "Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I can't fix our marriage by becoming smaller to make room for your career. She helped me remember that I deserve to be with someone who actually wants to be with me." The past tense hit me like a physical blow. "Was in therapy?" "I graduated last week," he said, with something that might have been pride. "Finally learned to set boundaries, to value myself even when other people don't." We sat in silence for a few minutes, surrounded by the evidence of his family's quiet contentment. His mother's garden, his father's careful home repairs, the kind of steady, unglamorous love I'd learned to see as limitation rather than blessing. "Is there anything I can do?" I finally asked, though I already knew the answer. "You can let me go," he said simply. "You can stop trying to convince yourself this is fixable and let us both move on to lives that actually make us happy." "But what if I changed? What if I made different choices?" He looked at me with such compassion that it broke my heart. "You are making the right choices for you, Maria. Your career, your ambitions, your priorities, they're all valid. They're just not compatible with being married to me." So that's it? 7 years and we just walk away? 7 years taught me that I want to be with someone who chooses me every day, not someone who sees me as an obstacle to overcome, he said. "And they taught you that you want a life bigger than what we built together. Neither of those things is wrong, but they can't coexist." When I left that evening, Jack walked me to my car, old habits of courtesy that somehow made everything hurt worse. "For what it's worth," I said as I opened the driver's door, "you were right about everything, about me becoming someone I don't recognize, about choosing my career over us, about all of it." "I wasn't trying to be right," he replied. "I was trying to save us, but you can't save something the other person doesn't want to keep." The divorce proceedings were swift and civilized, handled by lawyers who treated our marriage like a business partnership being dissolved. Jack asked for almost nothing, just his personal belongings and half the savings from my old job, before the big salary increases. He didn't want alimony, didn't want the apartment, didn't want anything that would tie us together going forward. He's being very generous, my lawyer observed, but I knew it wasn't generosity. It was Jack wanting a clean break from someone who had made loving her feel like failure. It took another year before I understood what I'd really lost. The promotion that had seemed so crucial led to another promotion, then another. I had the corner office, the impressive salary, the respect of colleagues who valued my strategic thinking and work ethic. I also had an apartment that felt like a hotel room, weekends that stretched empty and silent, and a growing awareness that professional success hadn't filled the spaces that Jack's quiet presence used to occupy. Blake, my former mentor, left for a bigger firm and barely stayed in touch. A reminder that work relationships, no matter how intense, were ultimately transactional. The colleagues I'd spent so many evenings with had their own families to go home to, their own priorities outside the office. Carmen visited one Saturday and found me working in my pajamas, laptop balanced on a stack of takeout containers. "This isn't living," she said bluntly. "This is just existing." "I'm building something important," I protested, but the words sounded hollow even to me. What's important about it if you have no one to share it with? I thought about Jack's quiet pride in helping small organizations tell their stories, his genuine excitement when a client's fundraiser exceeded their goals because of his designs. His work had been meaningful precisely because it connected him to people who needed what he could offer. My work was impressive, profitable, and increasingly empty. 2 years after our divorce, I made a decision that would have horrified my former self. I took a step back. Not a step down exactly, but a conscious choice to prioritize differently. I turned down a promotion that would have meant constant travel. I started leaving the office by 7 p.m. most nights. I said no to networking events that felt more like obligations than opportunities. Slowly, carefully, I began rebuilding a life that had room for things other than professional achievement. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Martinez, actually, the same woman who had helped Jack find his way back to himself. She helped me understand that my drive for success had been rooted in a deep fear of being ordinary, of being the kind of person who could be overlooked or dismissed. But being ordinary isn't the same as being invisible, she pointed out during one of our sessions. Jack never saw you as ordinary. He saw you as someone worth choosing every day until you taught him otherwise. The insight was painful, but necessary. I had thrown away genuine love because I'd confused it with limitation, had chosen external validation over internal contentment. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping with their marketing and fundraising efforts. It was the kind of small-scale, personally meaningful work I'd once dismissed as beneath my abilities. But working with women who were rebuilding their lives from nothing reminded me that success wasn't just about climbing ladders, it was about creating something worth having once you reach the top. I never tried to contact Jack after our divorce was final. He'd been clear about wanting a clean break, and I respected that boundary even when respecting it hurt. Love, I finally understood, isn't about finding someone who fits into your ambitions. It's about building ambitions that have room for love. Jack had tried to teach me that for years. In small daily gestures I'd been too distracted to appreciate. I couldn't undo the hurt I'd caused or recover what I'd lost, but I could honor the lesson by becoming someone worthy of the next person, brave enough to ask me for a hug when they needed one most. That at least was something I could change.